Going second cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Refers to cards that are ridiculously powerful if you're able to use them going second in the duel rather than first. And because there are so many very powerful going second cards in the game, sometimes there are decks that are built their whole strategies around just going second, so they can play as many of them as possible. And at number 10, we have Max C. This is a hand trap which has the effect where, after you use it, each time your opponent special summons a monster, you draw one card. This card is currently banned in the TCG, but unlimited in the OCG and Master Duel. And since it's unlimited in Master Duel, I thought I would include it on this list, where normally I just want to talk about cards that are not banned in the TCG. So, why Max C is a powerful going second card is because you can use it during your opponent's first turn in order to draw a whole bunch of cards. That way, you can then use them on your next turn to dismantle whatever board your opponent might put up due to just the pure card advantage. Or eventually draw into another hand trap that allows you to interact with your opponent to stop their plays. Max C is one of the strongest cards in the game, and I have a 30-minute video going over why. But the gist of it is, generic draw card advantage in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is so powerful in meta decks that it's usually a good strategy to just end your turn as soon as your opponent drops a Max C on you, rather than try to play through all the advantage you're going to give your opponent. Which, in essence, turns Max C into a skip your opponent's turn card, which is one of the strongest kinds of effects in the game. And you can skip your opponent's turn without losing card advantage if you're able to chain the effect to one of your opponent's special summons that they can't stop, like maybe activating a Vishuddha from their hand. However, since Max C is banned in the TCG, I'll also add another powerful going second hand trap to the spawn the list, that being Psyframe Gear Gamma. That is one of the few hand traps that can both negate any monster effect and destroy the card afterwards. Whereas most of the other hand trap negates only negate the effect and don't actually destroy the card. And Psyframe Gear Gamma can only be activated when you don't control any monsters, so it's pretty much only a going second card that might be useful going first too, if your opponent hand traps you before you summon a monster. And at number 9, we have the Winged Dragon of Ra, Sphere Mode. This card has an effect which allows you to normal summon the card by using 3 monsters on your opponent's side of the field, where you then give this card to your opponent, and the card has other effects that don't matter as much, where it can't attack, it can't be targeted for attacks, and you contribute the card in order to special summon the Winged Dragon of Ra from your hand or deck, ignoring its summoning conditions, and changing its attack and defense to become 4,000. The main important part of the card is being able to tribute your opponent's monsters for it, because that turns this card into basically a nearly undisruptible monster removal of 3 of any of your opponent's cards. Because there are very few cards in the game that have protection from being tributed for a summon. And if your opponent has a big bad Herald of Ultimateness with 5 cards in their hand to fuel its Omni Negates, they can't do anything about being tributed by Sphere Mode as long as they have 2 other cards on their side of the field that you can get rid of also, which is usually the biggest problem of Sphere Mode, in that sometimes your opponent just doesn't have 3 monsters out. If you're playing against a big combo deck that puts up huge boards, Sphere Mode is not really that hard to bring out, but against any decks that only ends on 2 or fewer monsters, then you kind of just have a dead card in your hand that you can't use. Which is why some people will opt to play Lava Golem instead, which can do the same thing but tributes 2 monsters, or one of the various Kaiju monsters, which can also do the same thing as both Lava Golem and Sphere Mode, except only tributes 1 monster, and doesn't take up your normal summon to do it. And at number 8, we have Red Reboot. This is a counter trap card which has the effect that allows you to negate the effect of a trap card, and then you can set that card you negated face down instead of sending it to the graveyard. Then your opponent gets to set another trap card of their choice from their deck, but also your opponent can't activate any other trap cards for the rest of the turn. And what makes this card really good is the fact that you can activate it from your hand by paying half of your life points. So if your opponent sets up a board of 5 back row cards, and you have Red Reboot in your starting hand, you don't really have to worry about that back row, because Red Reboot will allow you to push for game through pretty much anything, since your opponent can't negate a counter trap card unless they have another counter trap card that can specifically negate traps, like Solemn Judgment. Unless your opponent has Solemn Judgment, there's not really anything they can do about Red Reboot. Red Reboot single-handedly counters pretty much all trap-based decks in the game, because you can just completely ignore their back row for a full turn, and then just go for game with whatever strategy you're using. Even though you have to pay half your life points, your opponent doesn't even lose the card you're setting, and they even go +2 in the whole exchange because they get an additional trap card from their deck, it doesn't matter if you win that turn, which is the huge power behind Red Reboot. Especially if you're playing other going second extra deck monsters, like number 39 Utopia Double or Boros Sword Dragon, which allows pretty much all decks the option to easily put out over 8,000 points of damage in one turn. And because Red Reboot pretty much single-handedly counters trap-based decks, it's currently limited to 1 copy. And at number 7, we have Dino Wrestler Pankratops. This is a 2600 attack level 7 monster, which can special summon itself from your hand as long as your opponent controls more monsters than you do. And then it has an effect where, on a quick effect, you can tribute the Dino Wrestler monster you control in order to target and destroy any one card on your opponent's side of the field. And both of its effects are a hard once per turn. Now, what's really great about Dino Wrestler Pankratops as a going second card is its high attack power value and how it can bait out disruption effects. For example, if your opponent ends only on a 2400 attack Alpalooza Bow the Goddess, where they have 3 monster negates live, and you have a deck full of monster effects that you very much want to go off, you can special summon down a Wrestler Pankratops in your hand and then just attack over it. Then after Alpalooza is destroyed, you could use this effect to destroy another card and then continue your plays like normal during the main phase too. Or if your opponent has out a Spell Speed 2 disruption effect, like Zodiac Trident, you can just try to attack over it in order to bait out the destruction effect, where you can then chain down a Wrestler Pankratops effect to tribute itself in order to destroy the card anyway. And since the only condition for special summoning the card from your hand is just having less monsters than your opponent, you automatically meet the conditions as soon as you're going second and your opponent has out even a single monster. And it doesn't lock you into any kind of restrictions when using this effect, so it's pretty much completely generic and usable in all decks. Which is why the card is also limited to 1 copy, because it's too good of a going second card. It was pretty much an auto-include in just all decks, because it could also be used as a combo extender if you didn't want to use its effect or its attack stats at all. If you want a card similar to Dino Wrestler Pankratops that's not limited, there's also Alpha the Master of Beasts, which can special summon itself from your hand if your opponent controls more monsters with more attack points than the attack of the monsters you control. And then it has an effect where you can bounce any number of your beast-centric monsters to your hand in order to return a similar number of cards your opponent controls to their hand. So, if your opponent has a full board of monsters, you can special summon out Alpha, and then use this effect to bounce itself and one of your opponent's cards back to their hand, and then you can just bring it out again as long as your opponent has another monster in the field and yours is still empty. Since only its bounce effect is a hard once per turn, but its special summon effect is not. It also serves the same purpose as Dino Wrestler Pankratops of being a really strong monster that could special summon itself from your hand very easily to attack over something like an Alpalooza, although its bounce effect is not Spell Speed 2, which is why it's not as good as Dino Wrestler Pankratops, even if it does have a higher attack power value, and can remove one of your opponent's monsters without sending itself to the graveyard. And at number 6, we have Dark Ruler No More. This is a spell card which allows you to negate the effects of all of your opponent's face-up monsters until the end of the turn. However, your opponent also takes no damage until the end of the turn. And the good thing about this card is its last effect, where neither player can activate monster effects in response to this card's activation. So if your opponent has a full board of monster negates, Dark Ruler No More can just turn them all off, and there's nothing your opponent can do about it unless they have a spell or trap card which can negate the effects of this card. So, the main purpose of Dark Ruler No More is to turn off all of your opponent's big boss monsters in order to set up your own board of boss monsters, since you can't exactly win the turn you use Dark Ruler No More, since your opponent won't take any damage due to the drawback. But you can get rid of all of your opponent's monsters if you just attack over them, and put yourself in a much better game state than your opponent, because most people can't recover from having all of their big boss monsters destroyed. So even if you can't win immediately after using Dark Ruler No More, it can definitely put you in a very advantageous game state. And at number 5, we have Evenly Matched. This is a trap card that can only be activated at the end of the battle phase if your opponent controls more monsters than you do, where you can force your opponent to banish their own cards face down so they control the same number of cards as you. And what makes this trap card an excellent going second card, just like Red Reboot, is its ability to be used from your hand, but only under the conditions that you don't control any other cards. So, if your opponent sets up a full board of monsters, or even back row, what you do is enter the battle phase, and then immediately just end the battle phase and you meet the conditions for Evenly Matched, in order to get rid of all of your opponent's cards. And unless they have a way to negate a trap card, which a lot of boss monsters don't, as a lot of them only negate monster effects, you can wipe out your opponent's board with one of the best forms of removal in the game, since the way evenly matched removed cards prevents floating effects from activating and also bypasses pretty much all boss monster protection. The only bad thing about evenly matched is the fact that it doesn't have spell speed for protection like Dark Ruler No More, so your opponent can negate the effect of the card if they have an Omni Negate in the field, like maybe Borreload Savage Dragon. But if you combo Dark Ruler No More with evenly matched, you pretty much have a 2-card combo that gets rid of almost any board, as long as they don't have any spell or trap card negations, like Solemn Judgment. And at number 4, we have Super Polymerization. This is a quick play spell card which allows you to discard 1 card in order to fusion summon any fusion monster from your extra deck, using monsters on both players' side of the field as fusion materials. So, obviously, the best way to use Super Polymerization is to use it on your opponent's monsters as materials, in order to remove those monsters from the field. And the great thing about Super Polymerization that makes it a very powerful going second card is the fact that your opponent can't activate any cards in response to it. So just like Dark Ruler No More, your opponent's big boss monster negates don't do anything against it, and they're super vulnerable to this form of removal since it doesn't target or destroy. So, as long as you build your extra deck to have a lot of common fusion monsters that get rid of your opponent's cards, like maybe check out my video on the top 10 best Super Polymerization targets, you can clear your opponent's field while getting a strong boss monster out of it on your own. Like if your opponent has 3 dark monsters in the field, you can go into Predaplant Triffy over Utum, but more often than not, you'll probably only have to settle for a Mudragon of the Swamp. And of all of the equalizers, or going second cards, I think Super Polymerization is probably one of the better ones for lesser powered decks, because it both gets rid of super hard to out boss monsters, like maybe Herald of Ultimateness, while also doing more than just turning off their effects like Dark Ruler No More, and potentially gives you a really strong monster in the process. But it does take up a lot of extra deck space in order to run effectively, which is why you'll see a lot of combo decks that might like to go second opt to not use Super Polymerization because they don't have the free extra deck space for the fusion monsters required to play it effectively. And at number 3, we have Nibiru the Primal Being. This is a hand trap that can only be activated during the main phase after your opponent has normal or special summoned 5 or more monsters this turn, where you then tribute all face-up monsters in the field, special summon Nibiru to your side of the field, then special summon a super token to your opponent's side of the field, whose attack and defense is equal to the combined original attack and defense of all the monsters tributed. So obviously, a card that tributes all cards in the field is better if you're going second, and generally, you use this card during your opponent's first turn in order to stop all other plays. So if you're tired of going against a whole bunch of decks that summon a million monsters in one turn, Nibiru is kind of the answer to those decks, because unless their decks can get out a monster negate on their board before their 5th summon, then they're super vulnerable to Nibiru the Primal Being. In fact, Nibiru can just kind of win you the game on its own, as I once had a game where I resolved Nibiru 3 times against a Virtual World player, where they eventually just quit out, because they could recover from 2 Nibirus wiping their field, but not a 3rd one. And at number 2, we have Lightning Storm. This is a spell card which can only be activated if you control no face-up cards at all, i.e. only going second basically, where you can pick one of its 2 effects, to either destroy all of your opponent's attack position monsters, or destroy all of their spell and trap cards. And it's the versatility of this card that makes it one of the most played going second cards in the game, because it's useful against pretty much every kind of deck. If you're playing Nibiru, that card is only useful if your opponent summons a whole bunch of monsters, which means it's kind of useless against certain kinds of control decks, or decks that are able to do all of their combos in less than 5 summons. But Lightning Storm is useful against both control decks and combo decks, because you can just wipe out all of your opponent's monsters, or wipe out their entire back row if they're playing a control deck. In both cases, you're probably going to force out one of your opponent's negates, so Lightning Storm again can be a very good combo tool if you use it with Dark Ruler No More first, or the number 1 card on this list. If your opponent doesn't have a way to negate a spell card, because again a lot of boss monsters only negate monster effects like Appaloosa Bow the Goddess, then it's an easy out to all of your opponent's monsters. That only takes 1 card from your hand, that is also an easy out to your opponent's back row if they're playing a control deck. And at number 1, we have Forbidden Droplet. This is a quick play spell card which basically allows you to negate the effects of your opponent's monsters, while making it so your opponent can't respond to this card with a negate, and cuts the negated monster's attacks in half, and also does not target. So just like how Dark Ruler No More can turn off your opponent's board of monster negates, Forbidden Droplet can do the same thing, except it can choose to be immune to your opponent's spell and trap negates as well. But it does require a little bit more resources to accomplish this, because in order to activate Forbidden Droplet, you have to send any number of cards from your hand or field to the graveyard, and then it gains effects based on the amount of cards you send, as well as the types of cards that you send. So, if you want to make it so your opponent can't respond to Forbidden Droplet with a monster negate, you have to send at least one monster to the graveyard to activate its effect, as it only gains protection from the types of cards sent to the graveyard. So if you want to make sure your opponent can't negate it with a Solemn Judgment, you also need to send a trap card too. And then based on the amount of cards you send, you can then negate the effects of that many cards your opponent controls. So if you send 5 cards to the graveyard to activate Forbidden Droplet, you can negate 5 of your opponent's monsters, cut their attacks in half, and do all of this without targeting any of them, to get by targeting protection, which is definitely a very steep price to pay if you're trying to negate all of your opponent's monsters, which is why you usually only use Forbidden Droplet on a choice 1 or 2 cards, whatever your opponent's most high priority targets are to get rid of, like maybe a Herald of Ultimateness. And since Forbidden Droplet does allow you to use cards on your side of the field, you could send something like your field spell card to the graveyard in order to be one of the cards sent for Forbidden Droplet, or some of your already set back row, or just some of your monsters if you're using this during your opponent's turn and they're about to destroy those cards anyway. Because Forbidden Droplet is one of the few going second cards that also doubles as a Former Disruption. Since it's a quick play spell card, you can set the card to be used during your opponent's turn in order to maybe use Forbidden Droplet to disrupt their plays, or use it to send some of your cards to the graveyard if they're being targeted for your opponent's destruction anyway, in order to disrupt your opponent's plays preemptively. Forbidden Droplet is definitely a more meta going second card, because a lot of lower power level decks can't afford the steep cost of activating Forbidden Droplet. But this is a card that allows you to play through unbreakable boards, and guarantee you're able to play through anything, since it has the potential to be completely immune to all forms of negation, except cards that don't allow you to activate the card in the first place, like Imperial Order. And Forbidden Droplet is one of the most used going second cards, even used in decks that like to go first because it's also a disruption tool as well, which makes it a good going first card too. So it's a pretty good card to make the #1 spot on this list. But there's lots of very powerful going second cards that can easily take this card spot in your deck, where I would say the top 6 cards on this list are all of pretty equal power level, with Forbidden Droplet just being played more than the others. Alright, and that's the list. Do you know of any other going second cards that are much better than the cards listed in this video, or have ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, I'd love to hear about either of those things down in the comments.